Theos, which is a think tank stimulating debate on the role of religion in society. Paul Parker, do you want to give us a wave, Paul? So Paul is the recording clerk of the Quakers in Britain. So as I understand it, Paul, your role is kind of equivalent to the role that Liz Slade, the fourth member of our gang, plays as the chief officer of the General Assembly of the Unitarian and Free Christian Churches. So Liz, I'm sure, is known to many of you who are gathered here on this call. And we're going to be talking about congregation and culture and what it means to gather, to congregate at a time when we can't be together as we might ordinarily be. I was listening over the weekend to a book by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell. And it's a book about the remarkable communities and flourishings of people being human together that emerge in the middle of and in the aftermath of disasters and crises. And as I was listening to it, I was thinking how strange this particular crisis that we're in the middle of is, because unlike most times when the rhythm of the everyday and life as we know it is ruptured, ordinarily when that happens, people are thrown together on the streets or in improvised spaces as we find ways of coping and struggling with and making sense of and making things work in the middle of the disruption. And so instead here we have this crisis in which we are thrown apart, many of us, into physical distancing and even isolation, even if that doesn't have to equate to social distancing, to use one of the terms that has been ubiquitous in recent weeks. But I've also been noticing the ways in which this opens up unexpected possibilities for congregating and gathering and being in community as well. For me to be able to be part of this gathering that's taking place this week with you guys is something that would not have been possible if plan A of what the Unitarians were gathering to do together this week in Britain had been going on, because I'm sat in my kitchen in Sweden. And I was talking to my dad, who's a retired United Reformed Church minister. And on Sunday, he had been joining through Zoom in worship with one of the congregations where he used to be a minister in Scotland. And my parents live in Cambridgeshire now, so it's not very often that they get to be together with their old church there. So it feels worth paying attention to the opportunities as well as the losses that are present within this. So I thought that maybe as a way of starting our conversation, I could invite each of you, Elizabeth, Paul, Liz, to just share with us anything in your work in recent weeks that's been a source of inspiration and sense of possibility emerging in the middle of all of this. Elizabeth, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you so much for having me, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Obviously, my kind of expertise and experience is mainly in religious forms of community and gathering, but I'm fascinated by and a kind of cheerleader for non-religious congregations and communities, because I feel like the more we have communities of virtue, which is sort of technical sociological phrase, but one that I even despite that I quite like, and places where we can find meaning and belonging together, the better it is for all of us. It's been a really interesting experience, and I'll talk quite personally, if that's all right, initially with my own church, I'm sure many of you are feeling this, the pain of not meeting together. And for Christian theology in particular, there's an interesting thing, because the incarnated ministry, the physical human presentness of us to each other is so shot through the theology that it's been slightly messing with my head. What does it mean to be present to each other? What does it mean to be engaging in neighbor love without touch, without presence? And I'm still working that through. But I have seen real signs of hopefulness, in the sense that the community that is often gathered, that even in its scatteredness, is connecting, and sometimes is connecting in very deep ways, and is connecting in ways that permeate the whole week and the whole day. Which was, there was some of that, but rather than having that kind of locus of a Sunday, although the Sunday connection is also happening. The thing that I have been similarly encouraged by, Dougald, and we overlap in some places, is this sense of actual new community, or new congregation, or new connectedness that's possible, that's normalized. I wrote this morning that this crisis is globalizing and localizing and isolating at the same time, which is why it's messing with my head a bit, I think. But the globalizing bit, that sense of shared experience, and the fact that everyone is now very much willing and able to connect across great geography, means that I'm having these quite intimate and powerful moments of congregation with people gathered around just meaning making, and that wouldn't have happened previously, alongside the rhythm of my normal congregation finding its feet in a way that's beginning to feel like it could be nourishing enough for the medium term.
Paul, how about you and the Quakers? And I mean, my experience of Quaker worship has been of the importance of silence and being together without words. And it sometimes feels like these kinds of spaces and boxes that we meet together through screens narrow us into, the visual and the verbal, without that embodied presence that Elizabeth was talking about. How is it being together in Quaker community through these virtual channels? What have your experiences been over the last few weeks?
I think I'm really interested in what Elizabeth said about the kind of simultaneous isolation and coming together that happens in a crisis like this one, because I think in a Quaker meeting, maybe that's what happens every week, that, when you sink into silence, that can be a profoundly isolating experience. And yet, in a Quaker meeting for worship, there is this huge sense of togetherness, and it's not something, in my experience, that you can do on your own. It's a different thing if you are in a kind of personal, reflective space as an individual from when you're doing it with others. And I was reflecting on it because last Sunday, obviously my Quaker meeting, which is in Saffron Walden in North Essex, was unable to meet face to face. And in fact, we had 2 meetings for worship. The first was at our usual time, and we agreed that the most inclusive way to have everybody present for our meeting for worship was for us to all meet in our own homes without trying to connect on Zoom or Skype. And so I sat looking out the back window down the garden at the apple tree, and was so aware of the 30 or 40 or other members of my meeting doing something similar at that moment, and of being united with them in spirit and in prayer, and of wanting to hold them in God's light. And there was a tremendous, palpable sense of togetherness almost to the extent that you could sense when it ended at 11:30, when ordinarily we'd have shaken hands with each other around the room. And then later in the day, we held a short virtual meeting online. And there were 11 of us there, including a baby, and including somebody who we've not seen at Meeting for Worship for many years because her health doesn't permit her to come out of the house. And she joined us from her bed and was so pleased to be with us and to see us. And so I was really struck by the juxtaposition of those two very deep experiences of worshipping together, and how qualitatively it wasn't that different from being in the room. And so I think there's something very interesting about the nature of Quaker silent worship, where we're used to holding the presence of others and the isolation in tension with each other. So I was very encouraged by that. And we've seen a huge outpouring of Quaker creativity in finding ways to meet and worship and have a sense of being a gathered people. Over the last couple of weeks. It's been extraordinary.
And Liz, how about you, from the work that you've been doing with the Unitarians, and obviously, you know, this session today and the event that it's a part of is one of the fruitions of that. But you know, what's your experience? What things have you been surprised by or inspired by over the last few weeks?
Well, one of the things has been the sort of different shape that gathering can take. So on the Sunday, it was the Sunday just before lockdown was announced, which was New Unity, my home congregation's sort of first online gathering. And I sort of assumed that it wouldn't be very good because I sort of felt like, well, the screens are going to get in the way. We're not really going to be with each other. Sort of what I know, what I feel a part of when I'm, you know, in the same building as, you know, the other people in my congregation. Like, I just can't imagine like how that would translate to an online version. And then in that first online gathering, I ended up crying 3 times because there was a different kind of intimacy that was possible. And I think particularly at this time, you know, it was so moving to sort of see people's faces arrive on the screen, sort of just as just like this. And, you know, as Paul said, the possibility for people to be there who might not normally be there. You know, maybe they have moved away or, you know, haven't been attending for a while, but people sort of feeling like, well, no, now is the time that we do need to be together. So yeah, so I found it really, yeah, I found that there was a new kind of intimacy. And yeah, just sort of seeing that happening, you know, across the whole sort of Unitarian movement of people finding different ways to connect with each other, and to do their services online, but also going back to old technologies of putting things through people's letterboxes, and sort of knowing that there are plenty of people who aren't online at all or aren't very confident online. And I know that some of our ministers and other leaders have been sort of putting, you know, printing a sort of, you know, service, a sort of order of service or kind of work, you know, inspiring material and sort of, you know, putting it in the post to people, because knowing that that's the way to reach them. So even though I think a lot of us have spent even more time than usual staring at screens over the last few weeks, it's also interesting to think about the other ways that people could be connected. And I was sort of, you know, thinking about, it was Gavin in our Norwich congregation who was saying that he'd been sort of sharing packets of seeds with people. And so I'm really interested in sort of where the physical is possible still, when we can't be together in person. There's sort of lots of creativity springing up there as well.
Yeah, one of the experiences I've had over the past few weeks has been actually a kind of extraordinary sort of rush of nostalgia, in a sense, as this moment has created an excuse for regathering of communities that belonged to different times. And somehow, so, you know, one of those was we had sort of 24 of us who were gathered in Sweden for a week 2 years ago for the first course at the school called Home that my partner Anna and I are creating. And we just sent out a note to everybody who'd been there that week saying, if you want to join us on Thursday evening. And we had 10 of us for an hour and a half that Thursday evening, which was the first time that that group had reconvened. The first time it had felt appropriate to make the invitation to reconvene since we were originally together. And then the next day I found myself on a gathering of a group called the Tuttle Club that used to meet in London every Friday morning. And 10 years ago, I would be there every Friday morning for a couple of hours at a physical gathering with this group of people. And the invitation went out and suddenly we were sort of back. And it was, you know, there've been moments where it has felt like, you know, having your life flash before your eyes, but through the medium of Zoom calls. One of the things that I'm really interested to hear from you guys about, so I've been talking with people over the last few years in the arts and culture world about congregation, and often bringing in a language that comes from the religious traditions and practices. And it started with a conversation with a fantastic artist in Doncaster, a woman called Rachel Horn. And we were talking about an event that she'd been involved in organizing there. And she said to me, oh, Dougald, you know, it was like organizing a wedding. And I knew exactly what she meant. You know, the months of build up towards the big day, and afterwards everyone's exhausted. And I said to her, yeah, you know, weddings are great, but how many weddings do you want to have in your life? And the answer is probably countable on the fingers of one hand. And what struck me from that conversation, and it's when I've mentioned this with others, there's been a real sense of recognition, is that somehow in the arts and culture world, we've fallen into the wedding as the default scale and level of effort of a congregating event, of a gathering, when actually maybe the sort of deep hunger, the thing that is called for, is something more like the rhythm of the weekly service, something that can happen once a week and be woven in and out of ordinary life without anyone burning themselves out in order to make it happen. So I'm really curious if any of you, who are involved in the practice of week-to-week worship making and community, what lessons you might have for those of us who work in the arts and culture where maybe we've fallen into the trap of thinking that if we do an event, it needs to be, the scale and intensity of organizing a wedding. Any of you want to sort of jump in and start us off?
I'll jump in. So one thing that's often on my mind as I see people outside of traditional religious structures building new things because they know that they still need to have their spiritual needs met, if you frame it that way, and so but aren't finding them being met in traditional religions, and so are making new things for themselves. I've noticed how often the focus goes on that sort of celebrant role, someone who's leading a wedding or another sort of big, extravaganza, and that can be that's often where I see people sort of going first of the sort of the big rituals, the big ceremonies. And I think that's really missing the core substance of what it is that we're doing together. And I think there's almost like a danger, I think, if you're sort of only having weddings and not the weekly service, because I think that's where the sort of weaving happens. That's where you sort of get the firm foundations. And so I'm really interested in what that might look like outside of what we know as the sort of regular Sunday service, and what that looks like. What are the other ways that we can have that regular sort of very normal weaving of togetherness?
Paul.
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, I was reflecting on the title of this session about congregation and culture, and the fact that congregation is a word that we Quakers hardly ever use. It's just not what we think, how we think of it. So we talk about Quaker meeting, and we use that to mean both the occasion, but also the group of people who come together. And we also use the word gathering a great deal, which I think has echoes of Jesus saying, when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am amongst you. And so we're, I think, quite used to very small groupings feeling like a meeting, a coming together of people to seek that connection with the divine or the spirit. And it strikes me from that really what we're talking about is community and belonging, and what it means to be part of a community of people of like mind and of shared experience, who come together regularly. And for me, that says something quite deep about the nature of the religious experience, what we're doing together. There was a Quaker of the 20th century, a guy called George Gorman, who wrote a text that I come back to again and again in my own spiritual practice. And he says, one of the unexpected things I've learned in my life as a Quaker is that religion is basically about relationships between people. This was an unexpected discovery because I'd been brought up to believe that religion was essentially about our relationship with God. And I find it a really helpful passage because it completely, for me, echoes my experience of needing to come together with other people in order to have that sort of depth of connection. And that so much of our experience we gain through the medium of other people being able to throw light on it for us, through them just talking about their own experience. And so there's something for me about the role of the congregation as being a place where people come together not to hear from some leadership figure, but to come together as a place where we share together in spiritual experience with one another, and somehow draw from that the insights that we need to give us the strength to go back out and face the rest of the week.
And Elizabeth, you used this phrase before, communities of virtue. I'm curious if you can unpack that a bit to maybe share some vocabulary for how we can recognize the things in common between things that might describe and recognize themselves as religious congregations or gatherings, meetings, and things which wouldn't use language, but maybe participate in something that matters for similar reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I came across it first in Luke Brotherton, who's a political theologian, but I think it's fairly widely used, and it's really about this idea that congregational community of a size where we know most people's name, and there's a level of facial recognition and a level of continuity, are one of the most powerful engines we have, both in personal transformation and in cultural change, because we know both from theology and behavioral economics that we are incredibly peer influenced human beings, that the behavioral norms of those around us and the things to which we give our attention to will frame our choices massively. And that therefore, if you're showing up with a bunch of other people who are also committed to and you can put it's all kinds of different lines, but committed to living more meaningfully, living more deeply, living more lovingly, then you are more likely to actually do that, to grow in virtue in a community than you are as an individual. It's one of those, like this, this spiritual but not religious conversation. I think the real missing piece there is that our current conception of spirituality is often very individualized and isolated, and that the power of it is that when people come together. So that's my thinking about that. When you said about the wedding, I was fascinated because I realized my reaction was, oh, weddings? Like, weddings don't even factor in my understanding of my spiritual life or my sense of congregational life. the like actual service can be quite powerful, but it's powerful in a very different way. The congregation in the room are not there because they've been gathering weekly, or it can be beautiful and meaningful because we're all connected around the couple, but it's not a community, not in any sustained way. And so therefore, I would think that's a very bad model in terms of, you know, long-termness. And actually for me, and I come out of a much more kind of house churchy background, the meeting together on a Sunday is like lovely, but actually is more individual for me. It's more about being able to sing, and it sounds a bit more like the Quaker silence thing, where it's like something about being with other people all doing the same thing helps me connect with God. But it's the smaller groups during the week, and they call them cell churches and life churches and small groups and whatever. It's that the number of people who can fit in a normal living room are meeting together weekly or fortnightly to do something together and have committed to each other. That is the power. That is the bit where there's real intimacy and commitment and vulnerability and transformation. And so the combination of those two, the small and the medium, seems to me to be massively more important and sustaining and sustainable than the occasional wedding, which it's mainly about the booze.
Well, yes. I'm thinking about weddings and miracles and
yeah, I do like weddings.
Wine. Absolutely. But actually something that was coming out listening to what you were saying there, Elizabeth, which I think I'm hearing as well in the sort of artistic and culture making worlds and the social change and activist worlds, is a hunger for and a recognition of a literacy of scale, in which we recognize the diseconomies of scale, the things that stop being possible once you get beyond a certain size. Yeah. So maybe there's a sense that in the modern societies that most of us have kind of grown up in and come out of and inherited a lot from, we tend to know about the scale of the individual and maybe the family and household, and we know about the scale of society, but there's a whole kind of gap in between. And I see people like Richard Bartlett, who's a really interesting sort of activist, writer, thinker, doer, trying to invite people into a conversation about, you know, the scale of the congregation that, you know, doesn't work much beyond the size of 140, 150 people, because that's the community that's small enough that you really can know everybody's name and face. And then the scale that's smaller than that, which is like the house group that you're talking about, which is kind of the community of the table, the number of people who can sit around a table and share a meal together and be part of a single flowing conversation. So it's probably, you know, 8 is probably the optimum number for that sort of size of group. And that we really, in order to be human together, we need belonging on those kinds of small and medium scales, as you're saying, as well as the kind of the individual small family and the kind of sense of being part of a big community and society. What's been really interesting is we're having this conversation, there's this kind of parallel conversation going on that I'm kind of catching bits of in the chat, that if you put it on, it sort of runs down the right-hand side of the screen. I'd really love to invite anybody who's either been part of that or just been sitting listening. If you've got a question that you'd like to put to any of us now in the next few minutes, you know, if you put a question into the chat now, I'll follow that and I'll kind of read that out and direct it to everybody. That's probably the simplest way for us to do that.
I just wanted to respond to something that Elizabeth was saying as well about and you as well, Dougald, about the different ways of being together. And, you know, Dougald, you were talking about sort of arts communities, and there's something really special that can happen when people are creating something together, you know, whether it's an art project or something else, but where people are committed to a common goal in doing that. And I think there can be a real sense of connection and collectivism and, you know, real sort of deep relationship. And it sort of made me think about what Elizabeth was saying about how, as we're in community, where we're trying to live more meaningfully, and it makes it easier to do that because we're all doing the same thing. I can sort of see those parallels of like, well, what is it that we are doing together? Because it sort of makes it easier to do that thing together if we know that we're all doing it.
So there's a question here that's come in from Toron. Will virtual meetings become a normal addition to the regular services, especially for those who cannot attend in person? I mean, it's early days at the moment. We don't know yet how long we're going to be in lockdown for those who are in lockdown, or how long ordinary, taken for granted ways of gathering are going to be limited. But do you have any clues at this stage? Is there anything that you're starting to pick up about how this is likely to change things on the far side, beyond this immediate crisis? Paul?
I think there's a massive opportunity, both to get things right and to get things wrong. I think we are certainly seeing that there are people able to join a virtual meeting who would not be able to join a face-to-face meeting at 10:30 on a Sunday morning, which tends to be Quaker normal. And that's including people who are not well, it's including parents, it's including young adults, it's including people who just can't fit kind of collective religious observance into a busy working week. Because one of the things that's really striking about virtual meetings that are happening at the moment is that there doesn't seem to be an assumption that they're going to happen at 10:30 on a Sunday morning. So when we come out the other side of this, and whatever the new normal looks like, one of the things I really hope is that our default assumption that Sunday morning is when you do faith might get challenged. And it was one of my reasons for kind of going to Quaker meeting and sticking with Quakers in the first place, was a sense that Quakers weren't just about Sunday mornings. And yet it turns out that, like everybody else, actually we are. And so I do think we've got an opportunity to really think about how we meet and who we include and how we include them. I think the risk is that we get that wrong and we miss all the people who we are currently in this situation failing to include, who've slipped through the cracks, who are missing out on the excitement of seeing other people's faces on screen, and who are feeling isolated and abandoned and lonely. And so we've got to, I think, not take this and move everything into this new format, but say, well, how does this thing that we've all just learned to do fit into a bigger picture about how we do community well together?
Yes, there's a lot of discussion going on here in the comments, both from people who are really experiencing the ability to be included via these technologies and ways that we're doing things, and also the awareness, as you say, that that doesn't extend to everybody, and it's important that that isn't. We don't lose track of that. And as Stephanie says, one method can never suit all. Diversity of channels can surely only add to our strength. Yeah, sorry.
I think that it will help us to pay attention to what it is that we're trying to do with each way of gathering. And as Paul was saying, if we're sort of thinking that meeting together in person on a Sunday morning is our default, then there's the opportunity to not pay as much attention to what it is that we're making happen there, or what it is that we're creating together there, because it's just, well, we're going to be there anyway. Whereas when there's different ways, we're all experiencing different ways of connecting with each other. And I think we will start to learn, oh, online gatherings are really useful for this kind of thing if they're done in that kind of way. And in-person gatherings are the only place where you can do these kind of things. And I think it will just help us to be clearer on how to create gatherings well, whatever way whatever the medium is.
So one thought that I had when I was preparing for this was that one of the effects that a disruption can have is to make us notice the distinction between the thing we're trying to do and the way we happen to have been doing it around here lately. And that it's always good to be invited to reflect on, the relationship between the deep need and the particular forms and habits that have been the way we've been meeting that need around here lately. I wonder if any of you have sort of things that are being brought into view by these experiences that make it easier to name or question aspects of the ways that we've been doing things lately, as well as perhaps to notice the things that get overlooked or undervalued about the ordinary ways of doing things. Elizabeth.
Yeah, so it's an unhelpfully unresolved thing, but our church has been meeting in various ways, including ways like this, which are quite interactive on Zoom. But the Sunday services are being pre-recorded. The worship leader is recording some songs, and the sermon is recorded, and it's partly the particularities of the way our church works, but it just doesn't really work. Like, it is all the same ingredients making a completely different cake, and that I'm just interested by. I'm interested by, it's not just the lack of people, it's the lack of something happening in the present moment that I am missing. And therefore, this sense of, like, streaming YouTube videos is different from being part of a live exercise class. It really is, but why? What is happening there? That's what I'm pondering.
Yeah, Robin Hanford has just posted in the chat here, as well as celebrating what virtual and paper services have enabled for our communities, is it not also important that we acknowledge that these things cannot replace everything in physical worship? My Anglican, Roman Catholic and Orthodox friends are in a deep place of sadness right now as they're not able to participate in shared Eucharist. And so maybe one of the things that happens as we experience these ways of gathering is that they draw our attention to what is irreplaceable in being bodily present to each other, breathing the same air, all the things that we can't pass through this medium of the internet, however wonderful it may be.
I've been thinking a lot recently about the early days of cinema, when they just put a camera in front of a play. And, obviously that was an incredible thing to happen, but then they sort of started playing with it and realized, oh, you can move the camera and you can edit it and you can do all of these different things. And I think that's kind of what we're looking at with sort of online versions of Sunday services.
Paul, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think I agree with Liz that we're still learning what this can do. At the moment, we're replicating something that feels a bit like what we normally do. And it may be that there are adventurous new things we can do. One of the things I think I've been wondering about is that, at the moment, it's great to see lots of Quaker meetings finding ways to stay together online and to enable their community to come together. And it's great if people who've been away for a while can come to that and so on. What I haven't yet seen quite so much of is the kind of creativity that will lead to us being a welcoming community online, ready to say to people, here is a spiritual experience that you can come into, and yes, it's online, and not it's online at the moment and we're making the best of it. So I think there's something really interesting there. And I think for me, there's a link that nobody's quite yet made as well about the challenge that certainly faces Quakers, and I'm guessing faces Unitarians and some other faith groups as well, about how we really respond to the call to be diverse and inclusive. And are we able to find in online worship ways of bringing in people who would not come to something else? And for some of those, that might be a gateway drug to meeting in person, and for some of them it might not be. And, you know, are we open to being a community which meets in different ways, in different places and at different times, rather than having a kind of solid core activity that everyone connected with the community has to be part of, or they're not a proper member of it? So I think there's something really interesting about that. And at the same time, I think there's something really interesting about what we strip away when we move into this new world. What are the things that we thought were core parts of our practice that turn out not to be? What can we give up? And how do we simplify and strip back to the essentials of that kind of interpersonal contact and human contact with the divine that's at the heart of spiritual practice for us?
One thing that was coming to mind for me there is there's a theatre maker, Chris Good, who wrote a fascinating book called The Forest and the Field, Changing Theatre for a Changing World. And there are various points in that book where he writes, as a theatre maker, a director and writer and producer, a maker of plays, about church and about church spaces, and the sort of strangeness for him of kind of realizing the similarity between what he is trying to do and what church sometimes is. And one of the stories he tells is about the aftermath of 9/11, when he was working in London in an organization that was based in a church that has historical connections to the theatre world. And he said he noticed the number of people coming in quietly at different times of day to spend time in that space of the church. And his impression was that many of these were not people who had a relationship to church ordinarily in their lives, but in this moment of disruption and shock and grief and sense of things being shaken and called into question, the church stood there as a place whose doors were open, and that people found themselves wandering into, spending time in, and finding something in. And that's one of the things that I wonder when we ask about the kind of the loss and what isn't there and what we're not able to offer or give under current circumstances is, you know, what is playing the role that churches might be playing as, you know, spaces that people can come into, whether they come in and have a conversation with somebody or whether they come in and just sit in silence for a while. Have any of you seen anything that's happening in the ways of creating and holding online spaces that might be offering people that function, which I think churches and religious spaces have often played for people in difficult times?
I don't know, and that's interesting. That's both kind of unsettling and interesting. And we're looking at doing some research around what is the sort of existential impact of what's happening and where are people going for wisdom and solace. The fact that church buildings are closed really troubles me, and I know why. And it's not that I kind of rail against the policy, but again, as someone who's very committed to place and bodily presence, the idea that you couldn't create, if we can create systems for safe social distancing to go to the supermarket, why can't we create spaces for safe social distancing for prayer and for presence and quiet and a sense of sanctuary outside a house or a home, which might be a very turbulent or even an unsafe place for people. But yeah, I don't know where people are going, and I think looking back there will be just a kind of fascinating research project to be done, because I feel like people will be finding somewhere. Our hearts will find somewhere, that that spirit in us will reach out and will land somewhere, but where it is, I don't know.
Paul?
I think I've got two responses. One is that I think there are people doing very interesting things with online retreats, including online silent retreats. And I think there is the potential for that sort of space. The other thing I would say is that that kind of reflective, safe space that Elizabeth described needn't necessarily be external. I think it can be something which is internal within us and a place that we can go. And that is, and I'm not underestimating the difficulty of doing that in a turbulent or unsafe environment. And one of the big worries, I think, for anybody at the moment in the current situation has to be things like the rise of domestic violence, for example, while people are isolated. But I do think that we can, through providing some of the things that we've been talking about, equip people to go into an internal place of reflection and to look for God within in a way that perhaps for some they are more accustomed to doing in an external place and seeking something like a cathedral or a church to go into. And for some people, I think that's possible in the natural world as well. So I wouldn't want us to assume that you need external physical buildings in order to access what you're describing, Dougald.
I think there's something about a place being public or not, and obviously a church building on the on the high street that's open for anyone to walk into, is very public. I was also thinking about pubs. And I was thinking about, in living in London at the time of the 7/7 bombs, it was just so clear that we would all be going to the pub that evening. And that was kind of like how we found community, congregation. And as Paul sort of said, the sort of natural world as well. And sort of these are all places that aren't accessible to us at the moment. And the only places that I've seen online so far have been places that, rather than being public, someone has made that invitation and said, here is a space where you can come and talk about X, or you can come and be if you are Y. And so there's something interesting there about where are our online public spaces, or where are the public spaces that we can access at the moment that don't need an individual invitation.
So another question that came in through the chat that I think is really interesting, from Helen Mason. She says, I'm interested in the concept of membership, and if we become less centered around Sunday worship, do we need to think more about how that concept of membership and belonging works? Paul, you look like you might have something to bring in on that.
I think it's a really, really interesting question, because I think it means you have to get to the heart of what belonging means. And I think we're now in quite an individualistic time where belonging means you put in your credit card number and click join in most situations. And you get an email back saying you've handed over your money and you're now a member. And I really don't think that's how belonging to a faith community works. I think it's much more a mutual experience. And it brings us back almost to your question about marriage, I think. Is that you kind of make a deal to one another when you join a community, as a kind of proper belonging member of it, where I say, well, I think I'm a Quaker, and my community says, okay, we've checked you out and we agree with you, and we also, I think, accept then as a member of a community a certain personal discipline for how we behave in that community. And in exchange, the rest of the community accepts some responsibility for our spiritual nurture and our pastoral care. And so it's very much a mutual relationship. And I think it's possible to imagine that working in virtual communities and dispersed communities. And I think as faith communities, we're actually very experienced at creating quite transient communities as well. I mean, something like the Unitarian annual meetings or Quakers yearly meeting, you create a very strong sense of community for a time-limited thing, and it's very clear who belongs in that group and who doesn't. But over the longer term, when you're into the kind of, not the one-off marriage, but the routine weekly service, then there's something of the give and take about being part of that community, which needs to be there for the community to flourish. If you've not got that mutuality in the relationship, then I don't think you've got a community. I think you've got an online experience that you've clicked join and signed up for, and you pay your £5 and you get your 1 hour dose of weekly inspiration. And I don't think that's the same.
Yeah, and maybe this is back into this question of what is our attention being called to, both by what becomes possible and what is lacking in the versions of the online experience that we maybe have at the moment, but also, you know, how do we roll through beyond that so that what comes after this is not back to normal, nor sort of forward to a new normal in which we've virtualized everything we used to do, but actually a sense of possibility of the interweaving of the bits that become possible through these platforms and technologies, and the bits, the importance of which has been brought home to us by this time of separation from each other, but that we may find new ways of organizing, new rhythms of fitting into our lives and the spaces in which our lives take place. We've got just 3 or 4 minutes left now before we wind up. Thanks to everyone who's been taking part, you know, both the panelists who've been speaking in this discussion and everybody who's been part of the chat discussion that's been going on in parallel to it. There's loads of really interesting points that have been raised there, and I'm sure that there will be ways in which this discussion rolls forward. But I'd just like to give you each a minute, the three of you, to share any final thoughts before we close up the session. Liz, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think Paul's point is really important, that it is reasonably easy to see how we might sustain existing communities more remotely. I think I'm still unconvinced that that sense of mutuality, the sense of connectedness, that we are one body and without each other we fail. We are, you know, that sense of responsibility as well as receiving of gift would need to have a whole thing rewoven around covenant and ritual and commitment, so it doesn't risk becoming another kind of quite individualized, at its worst, kind of part of that consumer culture where we just receive passively rather than engage actively.
Mm. Paul, do you have any last thoughts that you want to leave us with?
I want to throw in another thing just to leave people thinking about it, because when I was preparing for this, I was looking at the Epistle of James, which is the one that talks about faith and works being inseparable. And we've spent most of this hour fascinatingly talking about the faith bit. But I think for us, certainly for me as a Quaker, if all I'm doing is worshipping, I'm missing out on the other side of the story, which is that, you know, what does this lead me to in the world? And so maybe there's next year's conference, if we're still online, we can have a panel discussion about how you get from faith to works in a virtual community. I think that'd be fascinating. And I think there are lots of people who could teach us about the works side of it, who we're perhaps behind the curve with. So that's a kind of parting extra thought.
Right. And Liz Slade, do you want to just...
I guess I'm thinking a bit about how aside from our current situation, sort of how the internet has changed so much and how it's very democratizing, in that people can get together in different ways, they can create things in different ways. And I'm interested in what that will look like for faith communities that have been relatively undisrupted by the internet so far. And doesn't say that they haven't been using digital technologies, but I don't think it's really disrupted the way that we do things. And so I'm really excited about the creativity and the innovation that can happen, and the way that it will help us to focus on what's really important, what it is that we're trying to do, how we want to be together, and use all of the means available to us to do that. And as Paul was saying before, sort of how we make sure that we really are welcoming to everybody.
Well, thank you, all three of you, and thanks to everyone who's joined us over the last hour or so. You know, we're all still learning the best ways of using these tools and platforms, and the best ways of hosting conversations and blending the way we might be doing this if we were together in a room for this hour, with how it is when we're all in rooms all over the country or all over the world. I'd just like to say thanks very much, all of you, for joining us and being part of this gathering.
And thank you so much, Dougald, for hosting us. Thanks, everyone.